One question I'm often asked about the Kennedy assassination is how organized crime, the Mafia, managed to craft a narrative around Lee Harvey Oswald, linking him to the Free Cuban movement, his time in Russia, and that mysterious trip to Mexico City. This narrative wasn't just a coincidence. It was fed deliberately into the newspapers, whispered into radio broadcasts, and spun into the fabric of public consciousness as America grappled with one of the most shocking events to unfold on its soil. And if you ask me how they pulled this off, I have one name for you: John Martino. I touched on John Martino briefly in my Meyer Lansky series documentary, referencing a Saturday Evening Post article from 1953 that first brought Martino's name into the public eye. That article hinted at his associations with the powerful Santo Trafficante and the burgeoning Mafia presence in Cuba during that critical time. Martino wasn't just any player. He was a powerhouse, deeply enmeshed in the world of organized crime. A casino operative, a weapons smuggler, a man who dealt in shadows and was woven into the web of the CIA, the Cuban exile movement, and other undercurrents in Havana. His loyalty lay with the Trafficante family, and his reach extended across Havana's casinos, where he skillfully hustled unwitting tourists. But Martino was a man of secrets, a valuable asset cloaked in the shadows. That Saturday Evening Post article, however, brought him out of hiding in 1953, just as the world shifted beneath his feet. With the rise of Fidel Castro, the game changed dramatically for Martino, and his role grew all the more crucial. I'll start by giving you that original Saturday Evening Post article to set the scene for 1953 and show you the crossroads at which Martino found himself as the Cuban Revolution loomed. By March 1953, the Caribbean had become a magnet for high-rolling gamblers and shadowy figures from the underworld. As political instability swept across Cuba and Haiti, the region's tropical allure masked a darker reality, an island that was now under the control of organized crime. The Saturday Evening Post dispatched a reporter to the islands to uncover the truth behind the glamorous casinos and luxurious hotels that were cropping up from Havana to Port-au-Prince. During the 1940s and 1950s, Florida, especially Miami, had already become a hub for mobsters, with the notorious Meyer Lansky at the helm of lucrative operations. Now, with increasing scrutiny from U.S. authorities, many of these criminals fled south, turning the Caribbean into a new haven for vice and corruption. As the journalist from the Saturday Evening Post would soon discover, the influence of American money and mafia muscle was reshaping the island economies, and not for the better. It's New Year's Eve, and the place is the Grand Casino National in Havana, Cuba. Our main figure is a distinguished elderly gentleman, let's call him DJ, who is discovering why Havana is hailed as one of the last great sinful cities of the world. Outside, where a tropical moon bathes the casino gardens in soft light, the vibrant hues of hibiscus and bougainvillea bloom in a riot of color. Americans, dressed to the nines, battle their way noisily into the casino driveway, bumper to bumper. Inside, in the bar, laughter crescendos as midnight approaches on this 1951 New Year's Eve. In the grand ballroom, the sultry wail of a mambo band blends with the chatter of the dancers into an insistent roar. But in the gambling room, DJ is oblivious to it all. His world has suddenly shrunk to the pitchman's table, where the green felt numbered squares, the 8 dice in his hand, and a small fortune in house money spread before him are all that matters. The dice cup rattles, and the dealer's deft fingers count and whisk the dice away before the player's anxiously shining eyes can even tally them. Back home in New England, DJ is an insurance executive known for his solid judgment. But here, in Havana's irresistible heat, he has already lost 3 times what his salary would be in a year. The impassive house credit man, standing beside the pitchman's table, notes another $1,000 on the tally, bringing DJ's debt to the house to $4,000. DJ hesitates. "Shame to quit now," murmurs a stranger to his left. The only way the house can win is if he quits now, adds a tall man lounging nearby. Spurred by these remarks, DJ, his eyes bulging from the stress, presses on. I had watched the tableaus unfold with growing disbelief at the open, unrelenting swindle. The game, at which this sweating little executive was losing $1,000 every half-minute, was nothing short of a carnival con. No casino outside Havana, outraged gambling men later told me, would ever allow such an outright fraud. No one can defeat a game where 8 dice are rolled, and players double their bets with every roll. The double or nothing trick, the speed of the game, and the smooth pitch of the houseman combined into a seamless strategy to crush the players. Hemmed in on all sides, the rabbit, as they called the mark, was stripped of everything he had on him, and eventually of his entire bank account back home. When DJ's losses hit the $6,000 mark, his wife, visibly distressed, quietly moved away. I followed her, but not for long. The thin man who had been kibitzing near DJ locked his arm firmly around mine. "People who don't mind their own business get into trouble," he said. Before I could respond, the man to DJ's left, a broad-shouldered Cuban in a dinner jacket, took hold of my other arm. "This house is run by the Cuban government," he said. "Any complaints? You talk to me. I'm the police." In a matter of seconds, I was ejected from the gambling room. DJ's wife had disappeared without a word. I later learned that DJ had lost $8,600 in 11 minutes before collapsing in a faint. More than 100,000 Americans visited the Caribbean last year. Many of them belong to that burgeoning class who, lured by the allure of low-cost package tours, find themselves entering a gambling casino for the first time. They are naive, unprepared for the trap set against them. Yet gambling, a forbidden fruit at home, is being dangled freely before them in Cuba, and many, like DJ, are booked for extinction. The honest and the gullible don't stand a chance. The Kefauver Senate crime investigation that dried up big-time gambling in the United States has pushed unemployed gamblers to the Caribbean in droves. Within the last few years, gangsters from Detroit's Purple Gang, the Chicago Underworld, the Pittsburgh Mob, and the New York syndicates have moved into Havana in such numbers that the city has become a haven for the criminal underworld in exile. The Caribbean islands, governed by their own laws, have capitalized on American enthusiasm for gambling as part of their economic revival. Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico all dream of becoming the new Riviera of the West. They aim to cash in on Americans' thirst for gambling, just as Cuba profited from bootlegging during Prohibition. Gambling is so crucial to Puerto Rico that the island's legislature recently legalized it, and this year, the insular government sponsored a trade school to train croupiers and dealers for the gambling industry. Haiti, equally determined to accommodate American tourists, used its diplomats to invite the biggest gambling operators to set up shop in the Republic. When that failed, Haiti's ambassador to Italy pulled off a major diplomatic coup. He convinced a high-ranking Italian casino operator to accept a monopoly over all of Haiti's gambling operations and open a casino in Port-au-Prince. The Dominican Republic last year loaded a 36-passenger plane with slot machines, blackjack tables, and dealers. They christened it the Lady Luck and announced that a carefree weekend in Ciudad Trujillo was available at a low cost. Customs and Internal Revenue agents in Miami turned the gambling plane back as an illegal operation, but the Dominicans found other ways to attract Americans to their elegant casinos. In Nassau, where the Bahamian Club has long catered to the elite, local entrepreneurs have made provisions for more casual customers. Bars, restaurants, and other tourist attractions are quietly adding craps and blackjack tables in back rooms to create a gambling experience for tourists of all types. One man familiar with the expansion of Caribbean gambling operations, Charlie Freed of Monterey Woodcraft Company in Miami, summed it up. We used to do only 5% of our business in the Caribbean, said Freed, who sells $200,000 worth of gambling equipment annually in the United States. Now we do 95% of our business on the islands. Havana has replaced what we used to do in the States. That's where the future of gambling lies, in the islands. The future is already here. A chain of gambling joints, lavishly appointed for the tourist trade, stretches from Havana and Varadero in Cuba to San Juan in Puerto Rico. In these establishments, Americans are leaving behind such vast amounts of folding money that it seems like they are privately financing their own Point 4 program. The revenue is making it possible for island governments and private investors to build some of the most breathtaking hotels in the world, hotels that American dollar built. At the Caribe Hilton Hotel in San Juan, which cost the Puerto Rican government $7,200,000, a gambling casino occupies nearly the same amount of space as the hotel's ballroom. According to government sources, the casino generates 60% of the hotel's profits. The casino's earnings, which amount to around $600,000 a year, have kept the hotel in the black since its opening and are helping to finance the construction of additional hotels. This is the contribution that American tourists make when gambling is packaged as part of the vacation experience, especially in Puerto Rico. For those who operate gambling in the islands, and for governments like Cuba's, which are grappling with internal struggles, the challenge becomes, how do we stop Havana's crooked gambling houses from killing tourism? The answer may lie with the individual tourists who are being plucked, those American lobsters lured into losing their money at every corner. In 4 out of 5 casinos in Havana, experienced gamblers have long avoided the tables. But the systematic fleecing of unsuspecting tourists started in earnest last year, when a grifter known as Martino arrived in Havana with a master layout for a scam. Martino's first operation was at the Sans-Souci Club, where tourists could dine on a $4.60 steak dinner under moonlit palm trees, while enjoying a voodoo-inspired 6-hour cabaret show. The chief figure at the Sans-Souci was Sammy Fianuno, an ex-Pittsburgh racketeer, burglar, and convicted thief. In January 2 years ago, Chicago and Detroit interests, including Joe Magliocco, also known as Joe Mayo, an old-time chief of Detroit's Purple Gang, moved in as partners. Martino and his crew initially struck a deal with the casino owners for a 50-50 split, taking 60% of the profits and leaving 40% for the house. Martino pulled in $30,000 on his first night. Over the next few nights, his take increased to between $80,000 and $120,000 per evening. When the owners of Sans-Souci saw their profits shrinking too quickly, they cancelled the deal and put Martino on a salary with a commission. Martino's fraud quickly spread across Havana, showing up in the Casino Nacional, which was operated by the remnants of Miami's defunct S&G gambling syndicate. The scheme soon appeared at the Jockey Club, run by American concessionaires in the Parque Central racetrack, and eventually found its way to the Tropicana Club. Owned by Cubans who had made their initial fortunes in the illicit numbers game, the Tropicana Club is now valued at $2 million and is regarded as the most famous nightclub in the Western Hemisphere. At the Tropicana, dinner costs $60 per plate, with an Afro-Cuban floor show as the main attraction, and, of course, a significant profit to be made. To maximize these profits, the club owners hired the most skilled conmen and pitchmen, like Billy Bloom. Bloom's deal reveals much about the money-making potential of the game. He turns over $1,000 a month for his concession and spends several $100s on drinks and other entertainments. In return, he keeps 60% of the profits while the house retains 40%. There's enough for everyone. When I checked into Havana's Hotel Nacional in 1952, the casino was buzzing with activity. Games, shell tricks, and roulette wheels spinning with calamity. All this came to an end when the Cuban government, under pressure, ordered a crackdown on gambling. So many tourists had been swindled that their complaints reached the American Embassy and Cuba's Tourism Commission. Among the victims was a honeymoon couple who lost the $500 they had saved to furnish their new home. Another was a mother of 4 who lost her husband's entire weekly salary in a rigged dice game. One international incident involved Dana Smith, an American lobbyist and a sponsor of Vice President Richard Nixon's senatorial campaign fund. Smith had given a check for $200, thinking it was for a fun night out, but when he stopped payment, he was sued in an American court and won. The court found the game he had played was fraudulent and illegal under Cuban law. This prompted Cuba's Minister of the Interior to announce that all gambling would be suspended by government decree. Since Cuba's gambling industry was illegal and operated only under protection, the decree dealt a severe blow. American gangsters, hoping for thriving enterprises both abroad and at home, saw their dreams crushed. In Havana, the frauds had become so blatant that Cuban croupiers began warning fellow countrymen to stick to roulette if they wanted to gamble. Even roulette could be rigged, but only by highly skilled cheats. At a crooked craps table, however, the house's cut was more than a player could handle. A masterful mechanic known as a button man could manipulate or load the dice, ensuring outcomes that consistently favored the house. When the player thought the roll was random, the dice were already stacked against him. Skilled mechanics could adjust the dice by as little as 5/1000ths of an inch from a corner, enough to ensure a specific outcome. As the players lost more and more, the casino continued to rake in money. "I wish you good luck dealing with the blackjack cheats in Havana," said Bagnowani, a veteran gambler from Milan who operated the casino at Port-au-Prince in Haiti. The blackjack dealers were trained to subtly manipulate the cards, and finding honest blackjack tables in Havana was nearly impossible. Despite these rampant frauds, many tourists still found themselves returning to the same gambling houses, lured in by the thrill of the game and oblivious to the traps set against them. As they emptied their wallets, these American visitors unknowingly fueled the profits of Havana's crooked casinos. The tourist who considers stopping payment on their check will find that the casinos have a system in place to beat them to the punch. Daily, when gambling wraps up around 4 in the morning, several Havana casinos rush players' checks to the airport to be flown to Miami. Waiting for their arrival is Reginald Reynolds, president and manager of Inter-American Check Service, Inc., with offices in the Saybold Building in Miami. With the help of a clerk at Pan American Bank of Miami, Reynolds gets to work. First, he determines whether there's enough money in the player's hometown bank to cover the gambling check. Several banks exchange this information as a courtesy, and a quick phone call or telegram from Reynolds' bank will bring the answer. If the funds are available, Reynolds airmails the player's check with a notation, "Please wire fate," meaning, "Please inform whether the check has cleared." Upon receiving a favorable reply by wire, Reynolds pays the casino immediately, deducting 2% of the check's value as a fee, plus the cost of phone calls and telegrams. This system allows the casino, which would otherwise wait over a week for the check to clear, to receive the money within 24 hours. Although this setup resolves debts in Havana promptly, players' bounced checks and other irregularities remain a common issue. In a 3-month period, bad checks amounted to $250,000. From Havana, an island-hopping plane whisks gamblers to Haiti in just a few hours. Approximately 20,000 Americans visit Haiti yearly, and 2 exotic hotels in the cloud-shrouded hills above Port-au-Prince, the El Rancho and the Ibo Lele, stand as symbols of America's contribution to the impoverished country's economy. But the man who can tell you the most about American contributions is Count Alberto Zorrilla, operator of the National Casino in Port-au-Prince, a man of noble birth, suave continental charm, and, thanks to his casino, great insight into the American character. "The American gambler is an impulsive fellow," the Count said. "He sets no limits for himself, neither in time nor money. The European takes it easy, plays slowly, takes a rest. The American sits down and won't get up until he's completely drained." The Count wasn't complaining, of course. Last year, he paid the Haitian government $200,000 in taxes, which was 20% of his profits. Given that, the Count's take amounted to $1 million. A colony of Syrian merchants and diplomats had helped themselves to the rest of the profits, but Americans were the chief contributors. Gambling in the Caribbean pays for more hotels, which brings in more tourists, who spend more money at the casinos, which then finance more hotels. The Count planned to reinvest his casino profits into a hotel and villas. Once these were filled with tourists, he'd open another casino. From Haiti, a 55-minute airplane ride takes you to the Dominican Republic. In the capital, Ciudad Trujillo, signs of American influence are everywhere. The monumental Jaragua Hotel, an American hotel on Mount San Cristobal, overlooks the Caribbean and Washington Avenue. Up the street is a statue of Cordell Hull, and the town's secondary school is called the United States High School. So, it follows that the leading gambling figure in the Dominican Republic is José Nud Simonis, a sharp-eyed, blue-eyed Latin who was raised in the States, talks and thinks like an American, and is called Joe. "When the games are going strong," Joe said, "they're lined up 3 deep, waiting for a chance at the wheel or the craps table." I saw what this meant to the local economy when an American cruise ship arrived from New Orleans, filling the hotel's casino, one of only 2 in town, with fresh tourists carrying pockets full of money. A Dallas doctor, playing at the craps table, placed his chips down on bets with a house advantage as high as 27%. Around the table, other Americans were making similar bets, all of which slowly drained their cash into the casino. An elderly woman from Chicago fed quarters into a slot machine, losing 20 without hitting a single win. All this was pushing the Dominican economy forward, turning gambling into a national monument. "This casino alone," Joe said, "netted $300,000 in its first year." When you land at San Juan's airport, a 2-foot-high banner reminds you that Puerto Rico is American soil. It reads, "Welcome to Puerto Rico, USA." Puerto Rico is indeed the only American commonwealth besides Nevada that has legalized gambling. However, the conscientious men who run the island's government haven't fully embraced it. "It's a tolerated evil," said Teodoro Moscoso, the administrator of economic development, "and we're scared to death of it." Governor Luis Muñoz Marin's administration hesitated before allowing gambling, even after much debate and study showed that casinos would contribute to the economy. But Puerto Rico took precautions. First, the government created a school for croupiers. 102 students, carefully selected for their talents and character, filled the classrooms to learn the tricks of the trade. They studied the art of rolling dice, spinning roulette wheels, and running card tables. The students mastered the odds, the calculations for a hard 4 and a hard 6, and the mathematical workings of probability. Their graduation diplomas bore the seal of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico and were signed by the Administrator of Economic Development. This project produced honest native dealers to replace the clever American card sharks with their thousands of tricks for fleecing the unsuspecting tourist. Then, when the casinos opened, the government brought in an expert. John Scarborough, a hospitality executive from Miami, who probably had the oddest mission of anyone in the industry. He was tasked with training dealers in spotting cheaters at cards and craps. Scarborough's methods were known only to one government official and himself. His training measures proved to be preventive and effective. One was to use croupiers' dice sticks, rounded at the ends, to prevent dealers from switching in loaded dice. By calculating the volume of play and the odds, Scarborough could also advise the house on how much it should expect to earn per hour. Puerto Rico's gambling, John Scarborough told me, gives players as fair a break as they'll find in any casino in the world, whether it's in Las Vegas or Monte Carlo. In the long run, the odds always favor the house. We caught hell from the opposition when we plunged $7,200,000 into a luxury hotel, the Caribe Hilton, Governor Munoz Marin said. But we're making 12% on our money. The insular government, as owner, takes 2/3 of the profits, while the Hilton Corporation, as operator, receives 1/3. The gambling rooms at the hotel, frequented by American cabinet members, senators and movie stars, should be booked solid with package tour travelers. The operations are responsible and tightly run. Puerto Rico's gambling law requires anyone applying for a casino license to invest at least $150,000 in building new facilities or refurbishing old ones. The success of the Caribe Hilton's prosperity has inspired local owners of the Condado Beach Hotel to spend $1 million upgrading their facilities. The end. The good life for the Mafia in Cuba, as well as men like John Martino, did not last long. In fact, it barely began before he found himself back in custody. Martino was arrested by Castro's forces in 1959 and endured over 40 months in prison before finally being released in 1962. What unfolded during his imprisonment was a meticulously crafted propaganda campaign by the Central Intelligence Agency and other agencies, aimed at building a narrative that Castro was inflicting horrific treatment on prisoners in Cuba. The strategy was familiar. Portray Castro as a ruthless leader, one who had unjustly imprisoned a group of innocent individuals and subjected them to unimaginable suffering behind bars. Yet, the truth was more complex. While the narrative painted Castro as a brutal dictator, these stories were part of a larger effort by the Central Intelligence Agency, which often employed such tactics against various governments. Naval intelligence, too, was eager to gain access to figures like Martino, aware of his valuable connections within Cuba, which could be leveraged for intelligence operations. The following article, published on October 8, 1962, reflects the charged atmosphere and the lengths intelligence agencies would go to in pursuit of their own objectives. An American-born electronics specialist who spent the last 3 years in Cuban prisons arrived here last night, free at last, following persistent appeals from his wife to high-ranking Cuban officials. John Martino, 50 years old, reported that he had been held in 3 different prisons and a hospital since his arrest in January of 1959. He was tried and convicted by a Cuban court for allegedly organizing the counter-revolutionary White Roses branch in Miami, transporting weapons to counter-revolutionaries in Cuba's mountainous regions, and assisting Cubans attempting to escape to freedom. Martino, formerly from Atlantic City, New Jersey, recounted his rushed hearing before a Cuban military tribunal in the early morning hours of December 18, 1959. He was subsequently sentenced to 13 years in prison. However, due to a severe kidney ailment, Martino was allowed to stay in a hospital for 18 months, where he stated he was treated very well. Martino explained that he had no prior knowledge of his impending release until yesterday morning, when armed guards escorted him from his cell to the Havana airport. There, he was shown documents indicating he was being freed due to his health condition, and the heartfelt letters his wife had sent to Cuban officials, pleading for his release. Cuban authorities notified Mrs. Martino, who, along with their 3 children, Edward, 16, and twins Vincent and Stephanie, 9, joyfully reunited with him at the airport. John Cummings, a steadfast journalist and confidant, found himself entangled in the intricate web of Cuban exile circles. From the start, these exiles were cautious, revealing only fragments of their dangerous exploits. Yet over time, Cummings's unwavering loyalty began to dissolve their guarded silence. Since Castro's rise to power, he had been a fierce advocate for their cause, chronicling their struggles with a dedication that earned him their trust. In his later years, John Cummings, a journalist, became almost a crusader for these Cuban exiles, recording their trials and the tribulations they endured in Castro's prisons. He dedicated article after article to their plight, struggling to smuggle out photographs and expose the brutal realities of those camps to the American public. To him, it was an honorable mission, a relentless pursuit to shed light on the exiles' suffering. But what he didn't realize was the extent of their hidden agendas. Agendas that would one day intersect with the darkest corners of organized crime and the harrowing conspiracy to eliminate President John Kennedy. Then, there was John Martino. Fresh out of a Cuban prison, Martino took to the airwaves with a vengeance, eager to broadcast his own harrowing tales of Castro's brutal regime. Book deals, radio interviews, Martino became the exile community's mouthpiece, attempting to rally American outrage and drive Kennedy toward a harsher stance on Castro. He spoke ominously of the Russians securing Cuba against further American invasion, of Russian generals and top-secret operations. Allegedly, whispers hinted at nuclear remnants, missiles or components still lurking on Cuban soil, a threat that would shake the tenuous agreement between America and Cuba to its core. Martino, now working alongside Cuban exile operatives, was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant luring Russian generals out of Cuba to defect to the United States. Every article he and Cummings put forth served as fuel, a relentless drumbeat of propaganda meant to stoke American anxieties. The following article delves into the harrowing conditions that Martino and countless others endured in Cuba's prisons, a testament to their suffering, but also a powerful tool in shaping American public opinion, drawing them closer to the exile cause and deeper into the shadowy brink of Cold War tension. Within Fidel Castro's overcrowded prisons, more than 20 Americans, some of whom have been imprisoned for as long as 3 years, are awaiting deliverance from privation, illness, and unending loneliness. All are being held for political crimes or, in the legal lexicon of modern Cuba, counter-revolutionary activity. Their fate now rests with New York attorney James B. Donovan, who recently negotiated the release of 1,113 Cuban invasion prisoners. Donovan expects to secure freedom for these United States citizens within 6 months and plans to return to Havana soon to begin negotiations for their release. According to a State Department announcement yesterday, the prospect of freedom has led to improved conditions and treatment for the prisoners. However, one American who was freed just 3 months ago said that the remaining prisoners might not have survived under the conditions in effect at the time of his release. John Martino, aged 50, from Miami Beach, was freed on October 7th after spending 39 months in Cuban jails. Martino reported that most of the Americans were ill, adding, "But the worst part is that they feel abandoned by their government." None of them were involved in the April 1961 invasion of Cuba. Most, if not all, were imprisoned before that date. Donovan stated that Castro has not demanded a ransom for the Americans, as he did for the invasion prisoners. He predicted that the Americans would be released when Castro was satisfied that all the food and money for the Cubans had been delivered as promised. Even the exact number of Americans imprisoned is uncertain. The Cuban government and the Swiss embassy in Havana, which has represented the United States since diplomatic relations with Cuba were severed 2 years ago, estimate the total at 23. However, Martino claims to know for a fact that 3 others are being held incommunicado in the eastern Cuban city of Santiago. Who are these Americans? 22 of them are men being held in Modelo prison on the heavily fortified Isle of Pines, off Cuba's southern coast. The other is a woman detained in the Cárcel de Mujeres, women's prison, on the same island. Some are American businessmen, others are United States citizens who had lived in Cuba, and some are likely soldiers of fortune. Most are serving 30-year sentences. Among those sentenced to 30 years are 6 young Americans who were arrested on a yacht on January 7, 1961, as they entered Havana harbor. The 6 claimed they were merely lost, but were convicted by a revolutionary tribunal and sentenced to the Isle of Pines after being accused of intending to join anti-government forces in Cuba. These 6 are Thomas Baker, 28, of Dothan, Alabama; James Beam, 34, of Franklinville, North Carolina; Leonard Schmidt, 21, of Chicago; George Beck, 24, of Norton, Massachusetts; Alfred Gibson, 31, of Durham, North Carolina; and Donald Green, 25, of Clover, South Carolina. Perhaps the most publicized case of an American facing Cuban justice was that of 43-year-old Austin Frank Young, Jr. from Miami. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in 1959 for allegedly operating with an anti-Castro guerrilla force in the western Pinar del Rio province. Young was imprisoned there in late 1959, only to tunnel his way out 2 days later and escape to Havana. Jim Buchanan, a Miami Herald reporter sent to Havana to interview Young, found him. But 2 days later, Cuban G2 secret police found Young and Buchanan in the reporter's hotel room. Both appeared before a tribunal, resulting in Young receiving a 30-year sentence. Buchanan was given a 14-year sentence, which was suspended and was deported. Another individual involved in the same trial was 38-year-old Rafael Del Pino, a naturalized American from Miami, who was tried while still recovering from wounds sustained during his capture. He was brought into the courtroom on a stretcher where, at one point, he heard his mother plead for his life. Another American, 25-year-old Peter John Lampton, who had lived in the Bahamas, also received a 30-year sentence for being part of the same group. Martino mentioned that 30-year-old Richard Pecoraro of Staten Island, a former New York City firefighter, was jailed for making slurs against the Cuban government and has been incoherent for months. He is serving a 30-year sentence. Other American prisoners include Leslie Bradley, 31, of Minneapolis, 10 years; Eustace Danbrunt, 34, an electrical engineer from Baltimore, 10 years; Edmund Taransky, 30, of New York City, 30 years; Daniel Carswell, 42, of Eastchester, New York, 30 years; John Gentile, 23, of Cleveland, 30 years; Alberto German Sanchez, a naturalized American, 37, of Miami, 12 years; Dario Prohius, 29, a Puerto Rican, 30 years; Samuel Lansky, 37, of New York City, 30 years; Vidal Morales, 25, of New Orleans, 30 years; Robert Geddes Morton, 41, of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, former head of the Coca-Cola bottling company in Cuba, 30 years; Mrs. Martha O'Neill, approximately 40, of Atlanta, 9 years; and Ramon Williams, 42, of Miami, 30 years. Before the improved treatment announced yesterday by the State Department, the prisoners' conditions were desperate, according to Martino. The diet for both Cuban and American prisoners, he says, consisted of 2 fingers of black coffee and a roll for breakfast and a scoop of boiled macaroni for lunch and dinner. I weighed 93 pounds when they finally released me, Martino said. He explained that all the Americans suffered from malnutrition, with most confined to what passes for a prison hospital ward. During his 18 months in the hospital, which was nothing more than a small, windowless cell, Martino said he did not see the sun for 14 months. His liver ailment eventually led to his release. The sun was, in fact, a rare sight for most of the Americans, who were kept in underground cells. The only time we were taken outside, Martino recounted, was when they conducted searches of the prison for hidden articles or weapons. Then prisoners were stripped naked and stood at attention for as long as 8 hours while the search was conducted. Yesterday's State Department report quoted Swiss diplomats as stating that the prisoners have been moved to a more comfortable wing of the prison with access to a courtyard. Most of the prisoners' families have not heard from them in months. Gordon Beck, the father of George Beck of Norton, Massachusetts, said he had received 2 letters but noted, "The letters did not sound like him. They were very businesslike and contained constant pleas for food." Mrs. Charles Beam, mother of one of the 6 seized on the yacht, from Franklinville, North Carolina, said she had not known for sure that her son was alive until Martino informed her. "I have written to everyone I can think of in Washington to help me," she said, "but no one seems to care." Following the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy sought a more tempered approach toward Castro. But within the Central Intelligence Agency, there were those who saw this as an opportunity to press harder, not pull back. In their minds, the downfall of Castro was a top priority, even if it meant using extreme deceptive measures to sway public opinion. Enter Operation Northwoods, a chilling blueprint for a theater of deception and terror. Imagine this: Cuban exiles, CIA operatives, and even Mafia figures clandestinely orchestrating acts of terror on American soil. The idea was as audacious as it was sinister. CIA agents would stage and commit acts of terrorism against American military and civilian targets, then pin the blame squarely on the Cuban government. The objective? Stir up enough fury among Americans to force the nation into war against Cuba. The proposals laid out in the Operation Northwoods document were staggering in their audacity. Among the ideas was the use of remotely controlled civilian aircraft, which would be repainted as United States Air Force planes and staged to appear as if Cuban forces had shot them down. They considered fabricating the downing of a United States fighter jet off Cuba's coast, staging the assassination of Cuban immigrants, sinking boats of Cuban refugees on the open seas, and even bombing U.S. cities. This dark theater was designed to leave the American public with a single villain in mind: Castro. But there was a line Kennedy would not cross. Upon reviewing the proposals, the president shut them down, appalled by the lengths his own agency was willing to go. This rejection not only marked Kennedy's disapproval, but also set him further at odds with the covert operators within his own government, who believed they held the power to dictate the nation's enemies. The failed endorsement of Operation Northwoods left the CIA with a bitter reminder of their limitations under Kennedy, a man who, despite pressure, chose not to unleash a war fueled by deception. This decision sent shockwaves through the intelligence and criminal communities. Kennedy and his brother Robert had uncovered alarming connections between the CIA and organized crime, involving powerful figures like Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Sam Giancana, Joe Zerilli, Carlo Gambino, and Russell Bufalino. This revelation put the agency on notice. The Kennedy administration was holding on to enough dirt to reveal a decade's worth of corruption in the CIA and the Mafia. The entire American underworld knew something drastic had to happen. From New York to Chicago, criminal syndicates, each grappling with their own power struggles, took heed. A Southern Mafia faction, recently exposed by Joe Valachi, stood alongside the notorious New York families and the ultra-efficient, ruthless Chicago outfit. At Kennedy's behest, raids targeted the Cuban exile cells collaborating with the Southern Mafia, such as men like Carlos Marcello. Bases were destroyed, and men were detained, some even executed. The far-right Cuban exiles saw the writing on the wall. If they wanted action on Castro, they'd need to eliminate Kennedy. Meanwhile, the CIA watched with growing fear as the Kennedys dug deeper into their operations, realizing the president could dismantle everything they had built and had kept hidden over the last decade. Kennedy had even managed to forge ties with Castro sympathizers within Cuba, promising a more open relationship with America. To the Cuban exiles, this was a betrayal, a final nail in the coffin that meant they would never reclaim their homeland. Blacklisted and excluded from future operations, they turned back to organized crime for support, seeking favors, funding, arms, as well as news coverage of their turmoil, whatever they needed to keep their own cause alive. Criminal bosses like Carlos Marcello backed them, bringing these far-right exiles into their fold. Now the CIA, the Mafia, Cuban exiles, certain politicians and elite power brokers had a shared target: the Kennedy presidency. And at the heart of this network, connecting every faction, stood Carlos Marcello, a figure of unspeakable power who despised Kennedy. In Louisiana, they had a saying, "To kill a dog, you don't cut off the tail, you shoot it in the head." To Marcello, the dog was John F. Kennedy. He would deploy every resource, every contact, to see the assassination through. Those backing him didn't need to know the details of the plan. They just had to be ready to cover it up. Remember, J. Edgar Hoover had denied the Mafia's existence until the 1960s, but in 2 short years, the Kennedys had shattered that illusion. These were men who viewed life and death with brutal simplicity. They hunted for sport. Some set traps. Others tracked their prey. For Marcello, Kennedy was the prey, and he lay the trap. In the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, a series of cleanup operations unfolded, with Carlos Marcello knowing the plan had been hastily pieced together and riddled with basic errors. Oswald, according to Marcello's vision, was supposed to be eliminated at the Texas School Book Depository immediately after the shooting, snuffing out any chance of investigation. Yet Oswald managed to escape and reach his home, where his housekeeper, Earlene Roberts, spotted him. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, only half an hour after he allegedly shot President Kennedy at 12:30 Dallas time. Roberts recalled that Oswald rushed past her, saying nothing, disappearing into his room for a quick change of clothes and to grab a .38 caliber revolver. His hurried, almost frantic movements suggested he was ready to escape. If innocent, why would he be in such a rush? If he had nothing to hide, he would have had no reason to flee. As he prepared to leave, Roberts reported hearing a car horn blaring outside. Peering out, she saw a marked police car with 2 officers slowly pass by, momentarily pausing in front of the house. The car wasn't marked with the usual number for the neighborhood's patrol vehicle, which Earlene knew well. When she didn't recognize the officers inside, suspicions flared. According to her testimony to the Warren Commission, the horn honked repeatedly, as though signaling to Oswald. Moments later, Oswald burst out of his room, ignoring Roberts entirely, and rushed out the door. He moved with urgency, apparently unbothered by what he might encounter outside. By this time, the police radio had already broadcast Oswald's description 3 times within 15 minutes, describing him as a slender white male around 30 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing about 165 pounds. This would make any escape incredibly challenging. Oswald exited his house dressed in a jacket that could conceal his revolver and appeared to be on the lookout for something or someone. Roberts saw him stop on the street, waiting as if he had just missed a ride. He wasn't waiting for a bus. The nearest stop would have taken him directly back to Dealey Plaza. Clearly, he expected something other than public transit. The police car he had been waiting for had signaled but hadn't picked him up. Perhaps the officers got spooked by the urgent broadcasts, realizing the gravity of their passenger's situation, and decided to abandon the plan, signaling to him as they drove off. Oswald, now on foot, made his way through the Oak Cliff neighborhood, still clinging to the hope that Plan A hadn't completely crumbled. But with each passing minute, his situation grew more desperate. Finally, near 1 o'clock, he encountered Patrolman Tippett. Eyewitnesses saw Oswald speaking with Tippett through the open passenger side window. Moments later, Tippett exited his car and began moving toward its front, likely intending to question Oswald. Before Tippett could reach for his gun, Oswald pulled his revolver and fired, hitting Tippett in the chest across the hood of the car. Tippett, caught off guard, stood no chance. Oswald then circled to the car's front, walking toward the wounded officer and delivering a final shot to Tippett's right temple, muttering, "Poor dumb cop," or "Poor damn cop," as he walked away. Now, fully on the run, Oswald was soon tracked by witnesses to a nearby theatre, where he attempted to hide in the darkness. Cornered, he fought back in a chaotic scuffle before being overpowered and arrested. As they took him into custody, Oswald shouted, "Well, it's all over now," leaving one glaring question unanswered. What was over? What did he mean by it? The pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place, the hurried signals, the police car, the frantic escape, and Tippett's death. But behind it all loomed a larger enigma. Had Oswald been following a plan? Or was he merely a pawn swept up in the tide of events too large to control? His last desperate act, an attempt to outrun an invisible force pulling him toward inevitable capture. Following Kennedy's assassination, as the shocking news hit the airwaves, John Martino leapt into motion. Martino, a crucial cog in this dark machine, was at home, already braced for the cascade of events that would follow. He instructed his son, who was supposed to be in school, to stay home and monitor the news, ready to alert him if any major updates came through. The moment the broadcast confirmed that Kennedy had been shot, Martino sprang into action. Prepared and precise, he quickly reached out to his network, a well-oiled machine of contacts he had cultivated over years, journalists, radio personalities, and news editors, including the people at Life, who would later purchase the famous Zapruder film. All of these contacts could amplify the narrative he needed. He knew exactly what to say, and to whom. As the world processed the tragedy, Martino worked tirelessly to weave his part of the story, ensuring that Oswald's image as a Castro sympathizer took hold in the public's mind. Martino and the DRE movement worked tirelessly to spread a narrative. Oswald was a Castro sympathizer with Russian ties, who had a Russian wife, who had defected from America and from September 27 to October 3, 1963. Oswald had visited Mexico, where he sought visas from the Cuban and Soviet consulates, aiming to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union. His interactions with these consulates were closely monitored by the CIA, who were connected back to John Martino, which had surveillance operations in place at both locations. Martino fueled this story, playing his part while Washington wrestled with its own response. President Johnson wanted a clean, controllable story. A lone gunman. No international conspiracy. With Oswald's death, this lone gunman story would prevail. But the other narrative, the idea that Oswald was working for Castro, echoed in the background. Cuban exiles like Martino and their organized crime backers continued pushing the story, ensuring that Oswald's alleged ties to Castro remained in the public's mind, leaving the Kennedys' rivals with the last word on that dark day in Dallas. As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was devastated by his brother's assassination. Yet he knew all too well how deeply his own dealings had intertwined with dark undercurrents of power. The Mafia, with its long memory and vast network of secrets, still held leverage over him. And now, with John Kennedy dead, Robert was vulnerable, having intimate knowledge of his connection to Marilyn Monroe and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. Senators like James Oliver Eastland were determined to tarnish the Kennedys' reputation, eager to expose the twisted web of Cuban exiles and CIA operatives still working to topple Castro, despite Kennedy's insistence that these operations had ceased. Robert Kennedy's grief was matched by a cold determination to protect his brother's legacy and the Kennedy family itself. As the Secret Service and intelligence agencies repeatedly warned him that his family remained under imminent threat, Robert became entangled in the cover-up of his brother's death, likely as a desperate measure to shield his family and preserve his brother's legacy from the abyss of scandal. Soon after the assassination, Robert received a tense visit from John McCone, the CIA director, who informed him about Lee Harvey Oswald's connections to Cuban exile movements that had previously operated with CIA support, particularly the DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, groups based in New Orleans and Miami. Oswald's actions had painted a picture of someone who had mingled with, and clashed against, various anti-Castro factions, creating a murky narrative that linked him to both intrigue and instability. Robert was aware that a contingency plan existed for situations like this. America's own strategies for eliminating foreign leaders had long opened the door to retaliation, where assassinations of U.S. officials, including senators, mayors, governors, and diplomats, could become targets. And Robert knew that in the case of any high-profile assassination, maintaining a strict hold on the narrative was paramount. If Kennedy's death had been retribution for anti-Castro actions, it required swift and absolute control over the investigation, the media, and every public utterance surrounding the tragedy. This meant a monumental cover-up involving multiple agencies. As details emerged and powerful players in Washington recognized the ramifications, they moved to control every angle of the story, cementing their positions within a government that had become tainted and fractured. Robert's hope for a cleaner, just America under his brother's vision had been torn away in a single, brutal act. Now, a coalition of powerful elites, bound by necessity rather than loyalty, united to suppress the truth. They didn't need to know every detail of the plot. They only had to trust the man who could execute it with surgical precision. And one of the key figures who held that trust was none other than Carlos Marcello, the ruthless Mafia boss who had both motive and means to ensure that John F. Kennedy would never serve a second term. The next time John Cummings found himself reporting on John Martino, it was 1976, and the stakes had never been higher. This time, the story centered around an audacious operation Martino had only hinted at before, an attempt to confirm the existence of nuclear remnants in Cuba, left over from a time of high-stakes brinkmanship. Martino, convinced he could sway 2 Russian generals stationed in Cuba to defect to American intelligence, harbored dreams of reigniting U.S. intervention, and perhaps even sparking a second invasion of Castro's island stronghold. Martino's relationship with Cummings had grown into a vault of confessions and whispered plans. In their private exchanges, he confided stories that Cummings could scarcely believe. Martino hinted that he'd helped plant false stories connecting Lee Harvey Oswald to Castro's movement, portraying Oswald as a pro-Castro zealot, a far cry from the truth. These rumors, Martino claimed, were a deliberate attempt to distort the narrative and implicate Oswald in the service of Castro's Cuba. In a 1964 article, Martino publicly stated he held crucial information about President Kennedy's assassination. According to Martino, Castro had uncovered an American plot against his government in 1963, and, as a retaliation, Cuban intelligence allegedly plotted to assassinate Kennedy. Martino, along with fellow anti-Castro activist Nathaniel Whale, even suggested that Oswald had visited Cuba in 1963 and been recruited by Cuban intelligence. It was a story that shocked readers and sent waves through the already tense political landscape. Yet Martino had been playing a dangerous game of truth and lies. In candid moments, he admitted to close friends like Fred Claassen that he had fabricated parts of the story. He confessed that the Cuban government wasn't behind Kennedy's assassination, but that he himself had been involved as a courier, tasked with delivering money and covert messages. He even confided in his wife, Florence Martino, recounting the web of deceit he'd spun around the events in Dallas. Shortly before his death in 1975, Martino made his most stunning confession to none other than Cummings himself. He admitted he'd spread false narratives to implicate Oswald, and by extension, Cuba. He even identified 2 Cuban exiles, believed to be Herminio Diaz Garcia and Vigilio Gonzalez, as gunmen in the plot. He told me he'd been part of the Kennedy assassination, Cummings later recounted. He wasn't in Dallas pulling a trigger, but he was involved. He implied his role was delivering money, facilitating things. He asked me not to write it while he was alive. In 1976, Cummings finally published the article Martino's Confessions Demanded. This last report shed light on Martino's involvement in one of the most shocking conspiracies of the 20th century, exposing the shadowy connections between Cuban exiles, organized crime, and the plot against John F. Kennedy. It was a revelation that underscored the complex, chilling reality of the era, a world where loyalty, deception, and betrayal collided with deadly consequence. By 1976, as Cummings prepared to publish Martino's explosive confessions, the House Select Committee on Assassinations had launched a new investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The government was hunting for truth amid a fog of conspiracies, calling forth major underworld figures like Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, two men deeply entwined with John Martino. Their connections to Martino were more than casual. They represented the murky intersection of organized crime and political intrigue that had shadowed Kennedy's death from the beginning. Trafficante, a feared mob boss from Tampa with extensive ties to Cuban exiles and organized crime operations, had worked closely with Martino in the exile community's mission to undermine Castro's regime. Meanwhile, Carlos Marcello, the ruthless New Orleans crime lord, was also implicated as a suspect in Kennedy's assassination. Both men, like Martino, had deep-rooted motives against Kennedy and powerful connections that made them suspects in one of history's most notorious conspiracies. Martino's association with these two underworld giants, who were now being summoned to testify, lent chilling weight to his confessions to Cummings. As he whispered the truth about spreading false stories linking Oswald to Castro and admitted his role as a courier in the assassination plot, the world began to understand the deadly network that had lurked behind the scenes. Cummings' article, detailing Martino's confessions, became more than just a piece of journalism. It was a key that unlocked a terrifying chapter in American history. The revelations echoed through the hearings, raising questions that not even the most powerful mobsters could evade. In 1963, CIA agents, a former United States ambassador, and a reputed mob contact man, covertly sent raiders into Cuba by boat in a failed attempt to bring out two Soviet missile technicians, according to a journalist who was aboard the raid boat. Richard Billings, former Miami bureau chief for Life magazine, confirmed most of the details published yesterday in City magazine, a San Francisco publication. However, both he and a spokesperson from Time Inc. denied the magazine's claim that Life had financed the CIA Cuban exile operation. In Miami, William Pauly, aged 79 and former United States ambassador to Brazil and Peru in the 1940s, also confirmed that he skippered the yacht carrying the raiding party to Cuba. Pauly stated that Life had paid the Cuban exile commandos between $15,000 and $25,000 for exclusive coverage rights of the aborted mission. He explained that he refused to bring any Life staffers along, citing that the mission was too dangerous. He also denied that there were CIA agents on the yacht. However, Billings, speaking from Washington, confirmed he had been present and provided a detailed account of the event. Pauly, who had headed two companies in pre-Castro Cuba, said he personally contributed approximately $20,000 to cover the remaining costs of the project. He mentioned that Senator James Eastland, a Democrat from Mississippi, had asked him to assist in the mission. The objective was to retrieve two Soviet missile technicians who were reportedly prepared to defect, providing evidence that the Soviets still had missiles in Cuba 1 year after the 1962 missile crisis. Pauly described the City magazine account of the event as inaccurate and filled with suppositions. Billings, now working for U.S. News and World Report in Washington, claimed that the report was mostly accurate, aside from the allegation that Life had contributed financially to the project. He stated he covered the mission purely as a journalist. There was such a mission, Billings confirmed in a telephone interview. It was not reported in Life at the time, due to our agreement that in order to have the opportunity to cover such a mission, we would not publish if it was unsuccessful. Billings also verified the City magazine report that CIA agents and a man named John Martino, reportedly affiliated with the mob, accompanied the raiding party as advisors and organizers, but did not go ashore with the group of approximately 12 Cuban commandos who were never heard from again. No missile technicians were ever brought out, he added. Billings emphasized, "One thing you should understand. This may seem like a significant event now, but in those days in Miami, this was not a big deal. In those days, these types of operations were happening all the time down there."